Thanks, Alan. We're joined by Secretary of State John Kerry, who is just back from Brussels. Mr. Secretary, in Brussels, officials are encouraging people not to participate in the March for Peace, which suggests they're still worried about another attack. How worried are you about more attacks in Europe?
Well, I think everybody's concerned because for several years now, foreign fighters have been returning from Syria or from other locations and implanting themselves in the communities. And this is the threat that we've all been aware of. This is why we've been pushing for a passenger name recognition flight manifest shared program within Europe that I hope will pass soon. We've been looking for additional screening. We've been engaged actually with the Belgian authorities for some period of time now, trying to fill gaps that they're aware exist. And I think everybody is now geared up to recognize that the fight is not just in Iraq and Syria, but the fight is wherever those fighters have come from.
What's your sense of urgency? Because those gaps, Belgian officials admit that there were lots of gaps in this case, and this is after the attacks in Paris. What's the sense of urgency in
Well, there's
Europe?
great urgency. There's a sense of urgency, clearly.
And there's a sense of urgency, but can they capture that? You're talking about 28 different countries.
Well, they have to. They really have to. And I met with the president of the European Commission yesterday. The prime minister of Belgium made it very clear. They know they need to move on these things, and hopefully that will happen. It is essential to the long-term fight against Daesh. But what's important for people to understand is we are making real progress in Iraq and Syria, and I mean real progress. In 2014, when they began to sweep across Iraq, that is when President Obama ordered the initial bombing that stopped them from moving towards Baghdad. And since then, we have recouped about 40% of the territory in Syria, which they had captured. We have liberated communities. When I say we the coalition, particularly the Iraqi military, liberated Sinjar, liberated Tikrit. 100,000 Sunni have returned to Tikrit. We've liberated Ramadi. We've liberated communities like Kobani and Shadadi in Syria. And we're taking out about one leader every 3 days of ISIL, Daesh. So we're making progress. That doesn't mean they're not a continuing threat. They are, and probably more so now a threat in some of these other areas where they try to prove their viability.
You suggested that these latest attacks are in fact a sign that their attempts to create a caliphate are falling, collapsing.
Well, it's not only that. This is part of their plan. They put people in other places, and those attacks will take place whether or not they are collapsing or hurting. But I think there are a number of people who believe that their need to reinforce their narrative, that even though they're under pressure, they're still this viable force, is the only way for them to recruit. It's the only way for them to try to provide some added morale to people that we know are very much having morale problems in Syria and Iraq. So, and we pick that up because we hear the conversation. We know exactly what they're saying. We know that commanders are ordering people to go in the fight, and people are saying, no, this is a lost cause. They're deserting. We know from deserters. One particularly recently said that, we're not protecting Muslims, we're killing Muslims. And this is not jihad, because it's Muslims that are being attacked. Just yesterday, I mean, people notice what happened in Brussels, but yesterday, so in the outskirts of Baghdad, a bunch of kids were lined up to receive trophies and awards in a youth soccer match, and a bomb went off, and probably as many people were killed there as were killed in Brussels. And this is how vicious and depraved, literally evil, Daesh is, that they attack children, Muslim children, at a soccer match. And that is why they are going to be defeated. I'm convinced. And we're making that progress, but they still remain dangerous.
How long is it going to take? Some people talk about, even if there's success in Mosul, it won't be until the end of this year.
Well, I think it's a mistake.
I
think it's a mistake to get, well, I'm giving you a sense of progress, John. It's a mistake in a war to start saying, well, this is the date where it's going to be finished. What we're doing is ramping up. President Obama has issued months ago, by the way, not waiting for Brussels or San Bernardino. The president, months ago, instructed the Defense Department, the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, CIA, everybody involved in this, to come together and provide additional options for how we can prosecute this more effectively and faster. And that is precisely what we are doing.
Is it being prosecuted as effectively as possible? Are we at 100% effectiveness? And if not, what percentage are we at?
I'm not going to, it's a mistake to start trying to make those measurements because it's an artificial standard. But let me just say this. Yesterday, Secretary Carter and General Dunford gave a press conference in which they defined what we're doing and what we're doing more of and better. And I think it's fair to say that every day we are gaining in capacity. Now we have to do the same thing in Europe. We have to do the same thing in other communities. We're pressing even in Libya and elsewhere. There have to be additional efforts. But I am convinced, as I've said from day one, I've repeated it many times, we are going to defeat Daesh. There's no question in my mind. And the sooner, the better, and that's the president's policy. He has said there is no higher priority.
I want to ask you about Russia, where you were, but first let's not leave Europe. You suggested that Americans traveling to Europe should continue with their plans, but, quote, exercise vigilance. What does that mean? If I'm scheduling a vacation, how do I know to exercise vigilance?
Well, it's really a matter of common sense, but there are guidelines, and you know, the State Department's ready to help anybody to understand exactly what that means. It means avoid a crowded place where you have no control over who may be there. Have a sense of vigilance to watch who's around you. If you see a guy walking into an airport with a black glove on one hand and nothing on the other, and there are two of them the same way, and they're pushing a big suitcase, maybe that tells you something. I mean, there are things you can be alert to.
That doesn't sound like much of a vacation.
Well, look, we live in a world today where unfortunately we have to be vigilant. I mean, look at what happened in San Bernardino. I mean, there are realities that there are dangers around. I don't want to scare anybody. I don't think you have to be. The odds of being hit by a terrorist are far less than the odds of an injury in the course of daily life, whether it's an accident in an automobile or a home or elsewhere. So people do not have to live in fear, but it doesn't mean you should be oblivious to your surroundings. There are plenty of ways and places to have a good vacation. I would not tell any friend of mine or member of my family, don't travel to Europe or elsewhere, but I would say do so with an awareness of what you're choosing to do, of what activity you undertake, and where you are.
You've been working with the Russians on a cessation of violence in Syria. Sorry to ask for another timetable, but how long till Assad is out of power, which is a U.S. goal?
Well, I can't tell you that, but if Assad is not going to move to the side and cede to the transition that Iran and Russia and all the other nations in the International Security Group have called for and supported, if he doesn't do that, there will not be peace in Syria. It is not sort of a discretionary choice that we are making where we say, oh, Assad must go because we simply want him to go. It's because you can't end the war while Assad is there. And you can't end the war because the opposition will never give up, and the people who support them will never stop supporting them while Assad is there. So Russia has to understand, as does Iran, that we're ready to find an equation where we have a transition that meets the needs of a Syria that is united, that protects all minorities, where it is non-sectarian, where the people of Syria make the choice about their future leader. But that has to take place or you cannot have peace. It's that simple.
And until the
I might comment that Easter Sunday represents 1 month of this cessation of hostilities staying in place. And what we agreed on in Moscow with President Putin just the other day is that we now have a stronger protocol for how to continue to keep that cessation working and working better. So as long as we can keep that moving, and as long as we keep humanitarian assistance moving to the Syrian people without restraint, then we keep open the political space within which to negotiate and hopefully effect this transition.
Where are the Russians on the question of a post-Assad regime?
The Russians believe, they're not wedded to Assad. They believe that the Syrian people must decide in the context of this political process. But they understand that there has to be a political transition. And Russia, as did Iran, signed on with a public affirmation of that position in the communique that was issued twice in Vienna, then subsequently in a UN Security Council resolution that passed unanimously, and then in Munich again they reaffirmed this transition must take place.
I want to ask you about criticism with respect to Russia. The argument is that Putin has won in Syria, that he has been able to get a foothold in the Middle East because of U.S. policy.
Frankly, I find that ridiculous. Russia has had a foothold. Russia built the air defense system of Syria years ago.
But they've gotten more of one.
Well, so more power, have at it. We have base access in Incirlik in Turkey. We have bases all through the Middle East, in Bahrain, and in Qatar. We have access along with our allies. We have alliances in the region. We're working with the GCC. I see no threat whatsoever to the fact that Russia has some additional foundation in Syria where we don't want a base, where we are not looking for some kind of a long-term presence. If Russia can help stabilize and provide for a peace process that actually ends this war, which is putting existential pressure on Europe, as well as existential pressure on Jordan, on Lebanon, and creating an environment that threatens Israel. You talk about threats to Israel, that turmoil is a threat to Israel. So if Russia can help us, and it is right now, Russia has helped bring about the Iran nuclear agreement. Russia helped get the chemical weapons out of Syria. Russia is now helping with the cessation of hostilities. And if Russia can help us to actually effect this political transition, that is all to the strategic interest of the United States of America.
You met for a very long time with Vladimir Putin. What, based on those meetings and this help that you've just described, how should Americans think about Vladimir Putin?
There are still contradictions that we need to resolve Ukraine. Ukraine remains a challenge. We worked on Ukraine. We talked at length about how we could move to have the full implementation of the Minsk process. But clearly, we still have sanctions in place because of what Russia chose to do with respect to Crimea and respect to the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That remains a challenge. There are other challenges, obviously. But at the same time, Russia has cooperated with us on the Iran negotiations. Russia has continued to cooperate in other areas that are important to us. Russia has offered to be helpful with respect to Yemen, respect to Libya, and other places. I think we live in a world where it is just not black and white all the time. That we don't have the luxury of sitting there and just taking, pretending that we're somehow ideologically pure and therefore we're not going to deal practically with issues. This is much more, what people haven't gotten used to, John. This is not the same world that I grew up in and most of us knew in the 20th century, where it was a bipolar East-West Cold War. This is a world much more like the 19th century or 18th century, where individual states and state interests are at risk, and you have to have more balance of power and recognition of how you achieve your interests. And the fact is, we are dealing not so much, though obviously there's a state actor conflict in Ukraine, but most of our challenge in the world today is coming from non-state actors. And that is a very different, kettle of fish.
Finally, on politics, the president was criticized for going to a baseball game in Cuba after the Brussels attacks, the tango in Argentina. What is your response to the critics who say sticking with his schedule was discordant when there was this happening in Europe?
My response is to quote Charles Krauthammer, President of the United States' schedule is not set by terrorists. The President of the United States has major diplomatic responsibilities. He has to engage with other countries. That was an important part of trying to build a relationship and achieve some of our goals with respect to human rights, with respect to transformation in Syria, in Cuba, and elsewhere. And I think the president, life doesn't stop because one terrible incident takes place in one place. The president responded to it. He talked to the prime minister of Belgium from Cuba.
So
I talked to the foreign minister from Cuba. And and an FBI team went to Belgium, is working with them now. We've been in direct contact every minute. So I don't think the president lost one tick. And on the contrary, he continued what he had to do to engage in the diplomacy that had been pre-decided on.
In response to the Brussels bombing from Republicans, we've gotten a series of things, more talk about banning Muslim immigrants, talk about surveilling Muslim neighborhoods, and also waterboarding. As you deal with people overseas, is that seen as the circus of campaigning, or is there any way in which that rhetoric has any effect overseas?
As I answer that, and I want to answer it, it's a very important question, let me just also comment. When the Boston Marathon bombing took place, Boston Strong grew up as a very important notion, and the world took note of it. Boston did not stop everything. In fact, Boston insisted we were going to continue to do the things we need to do because we wouldn't let terrorists disrupt us. I think the president made a statement about that. Now, with respect to the campaign, everywhere I go, every leader I meet, they ask about what is happening in America. They cannot believe it. I think it is fair to say that they're shocked. They don't know where it's taking the United States of America. It upsets people's sense of equilibrium about our steadiness, about our reliability. And to some degree, I must say to you, some of the questions, the way they're posed to me, it's clear to me that what's happening is an embarrassment to our country.
All right, Secretary of State John Kerry, thank you.
Thank you.